Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really complex and pretty important question.
Hmm.
How does Russia view conflict and war? And what does its history really have to do with that perspective?
Right.
We've got some fascinating material in front of us, some excerpts from an article offering a very specific take on this. And it draws a pretty sharp contrast right from the get-go.
That's right. The source material we're digging into today, it presents this strong argument. It basically links Russia's historical experiences, especially its very long and often brutal history with war and invasion, directly to how it sees the world and acts today.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission really in this deep dive is to explore what this specific source says about that deep connection between the past and the present.
And it does uncover some surprising details, some historical points and contrasts that might challenge how many of us, maybe particularly in the West, tend to think about war.
Yeah, it definitely offers a different lens.
Yeah. Okay, so let's unpack this then. Our source, it immediately hits you with this core contrast. How different nations see war.
Hmm.
It suggests that for countries like, say, the United States, war is often seen as an exception, right? Something outside the norm, a temporary state.
And the source seems to attribute this view, well, largely, to the fact that the U.S., almost uniquely among major powers, hasn't really endured foreign occupation on its own soil. Not in the same way.
Right.
Our material mentions that even the combined loss of, around 500,000 American soldiers in World War II and Vietnam, which it says deeply disturbed the American psyche.
Yeah.
It frames that loss as evidence of how, perhaps unaccustomed the U.S. is to war's direct, devastating impact compared to, say, Russia.
Which, I mean, obviously that's an absolutely tragic loss, 500,000 people. But our source argues it pales in comparison to the scale of loss it describes for Russia throughout its history.
Exactly.
The article puts it quite starkly. It says Russia's history is simply filled with countless wars. It's not the exception, it's almost the background noise.
And the numbers the source gives are, they're staggering. It highlights World War II alone. Russia suffering more than 20 million deaths.
20 million.
20 million. Can you even picture that scale?
Yeah.
And it notes that Hitler's siege of Leningrad, for example, wasn't just about conquest. The aim, it says, was explicit annihilation.
Annihilation.
Yeah. And within just 5 years of that war, the source claims something like three-quarters of Russia's young male population was wiped out.
3/4. That figure is it's hard to comprehend.
It really is. And if you look even further back, our source points out that during World War I, then the revolution, the Civil War, over maybe 6 or 7 years, around 10 million Russians died. And this was when the total population was only about 180 million.
Wow.
So you see this pattern, right? Immense, repeated demographic devastation just woven into the fabric of the nation, according to this text.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The source is basically arguing that understanding this unimaginable scale of loss, this constant historical trauma, it's absolutely key to grasping its main point about the present.
Exactly. It's foundational to the perspective presented here.
And to do that, the source really dives deep into specific historical invasions, specific conflicts that it argues have fundamentally shaped Russia's perspective.
Yeah, it gives concrete examples.
Like the invasion in 1812, Napoleon's massive army, the largest Europe had seen back then, pushing all the way to Moscow, burning Moscow. And the article reminds us this isn't just some dry historical date, it's the backdrop for Tolstoy's War and Peace, a cultural touchstone.
Right, embedded in the culture. And it pulls us back even further to the 13th through 15th centuries. The Mongols and Tatars,
Yeah.
destroying many Russian towns, ruling for centuries. And even after their main defeat, the source notes, these groups continued brutal raids. It specifically mentions places like Crimea.
And the source really details some of that brutality, how they burned Moscow, not once but twice, enslaved Russians, sold them in markets far away, like in Arab and Turkish lands.
And this history, according to our source, this is precisely why a place like Crimea holds such profound, almost existential significance in what it calls the Russian psyche.
So it's not just geography?
Not at all, according to this. It's presented as a historical symbol. Brutal foreign invasions, horrific oppression, but also fierce resistance. It's all tied up in that specific place. The source even includes these historical notes, pointing out things like how Ukrainians were once apparently called Little Russians,
Right, I saw that.
and how Ukraine became a Soviet province under Lenin in 1919. But before that, it says it was part of Russia for centuries, and Russia itself traced its origins back to Kiev on Rus.
So the argument here is that this history isn't distant. It feels very present, very foundational in this view.
That seems to be the core argument, yes. It's not just academic history. It's portrayed as a kind of living memory that deeply impacts current thinking.
Okay, so building on that idea, the source argues that because of this constant history of conflict, of invasion, war hasn't just been something that happened to Russia. It's become deeply embedded in its very existence, its identity.
Right. It even cites figures like Nikolai Sakhotin, a 19th century head of the Russian military academy, who apparently calculated that 2/3 of the previous 5 centuries in Russia were spent fighting wars. 2/3.
Wow.
And the source suggests the 20th century just continued that pattern, constant conflict.
And because of this relentless history, the source claims Russian society holds this unique, very profound reverence for its soldiers, for war memorials, something it suggests you don't see to quite the same degree elsewhere.
Yeah, it gives some powerful examples.
Like in Moscow, it says newlyweds traditionally make their first stop at the tomb of the unknown soldier. To lay flowers? That's quite a statement.
It is. And Victory Day, May 9th, commemorating the defeat of Hitler. It's described in our source as Russia's absolute grandest national holiday, observed with incredible reverence across the board. And the article argues this shows a rare kind of national unity, all centered around this historical survival narrative.
What's particularly fascinating, I thought, was how the source brings in the role of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Ah, yes, that was interesting.
It points out that the church has actually declared many Russian warriors as saints. Not primarily, it says, for spreading religious beliefs, but specifically for protecting society, protecting the homeland from invaders.
Exactly. It names figures like Dmitry Donskoy, Alexander Nevsky, Admiral Ushakov, and the source notes why they were sanctified for defending against or liberating the land from groups like the Mongols, the Teutons.
Those tribes from northern Germany and Denmark, right?
Yeah, and the Turks. And our material even references Hans Morgenthau's classic book, Politics Among Nations.
Oh, yeah.
And its portrayal of the Russian soldier's character, describing this blend of, compassion and resolve observed in Berlin after World War II. The source implies this character was forged by this very history of hardship and defense.
So the picture it's painting, based on this source, is one where war isn't just, a political or military event. It's something deeply integrated into the cultural fabric, the spiritual life, the national identity itself.
That seems to be the core message, yes.
Okay, now let's bring this historical narrative forward to the current conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. Our source connects it directly back to this long view of history.
It does. It acknowledges the common Western view first, stating that the attack on Ukraine is widely seen as unjust, unnecessary, standard view for many.
Right.
But then it pivots. It presents the Russian view, as stated in this source. And that view is, given their history, Russians tend to see it as a battle for survival, a defense against what they perceive as existential threats.
And the source points specifically to the issue of NATO expansion to explain this view.
Yes, it lays out a sequence of events from that perspective. It claims that after Germany's reunification, the U.S. had given assurances, promises, even that NATO would not expand eastward.
Okay, that's the claim in the source.
That's the claim. Yet, over time, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, they did join NATO.
Right.
So, according to the perspective presented in our source, when Ukraine, too, started preparing to join NATO, Putin came to believe the threat had finally reached Russia's doorstep. The buffer was gone.
And the source argues that this historical context, this deep-seated fear of invasion, combined with this perceived sequence of events regarding NATO. That's why, in this view, ordinary Russians support Putin's stance.
Yes. The argument is they see it through that specific lens. The long history of invasion, and the perceived need for survival against an encroaching force.
Okay, and it's really important we emphasize this again here for everyone listening. We are strictly presenting the viewpoint from the source material. We're impartially reporting on the claims and the interpretation it provides. We are not endorsing or validating these claims ourselves.
Absolutely crucial.
This source offers one specific lens, one interpretation, through which to view these incredibly complex events.
Precisely. And the source concludes its historical analysis by reiterating its claim that, well, given Russia's unique and devastating history, making every effort to win a war, no matter the cost, seems natural to Russians. Again, from the perspective offered in this article.
It's certainly a heavy perspective, isn't it? Anchoring current events so firmly in centuries of perceived existential threat.
It definitely frames it that way.
Ultimately, then, our source concludes that precisely because of this unique history and worldview, Russia is inherently difficult to understand, at least through the conventional lenses used by many other nations.
Yeah, it quotes the 19th century Russian poet Fyodor Tuchev. You might know the line, Russia cannot be measured with ordinary standards.
Mm-hmm.
And the source states quite clearly that it believes these words still hold true today, that Russia operates on a different historical wavelength, perhaps.
The source even offers a very specific critique related to President Trump's actions and statements regarding the conflict. It claims he is making a fundamental mistake by calling Putin crazy, suggesting, from the source's viewpoint, that this shows a lack of understanding of both the Russian character and their deep history.
And the source makes another strong assertion towards the end. It says the U.S. has morally violated the promise it made to Russia regarding NATO's expansion policy.
Okay, and again, just to be crystal clear for everyone listening, we are reporting on the specific claims and viewpoints within the source material here. These are assertions made by the author of the article we're examining.
That's right.
They are not validated or endorsed by us in any way. We're just presenting the argument as laid out in the text.
Exactly. And the source simply concludes with, the wish that the war should end. But it really emphasizes these deep historical roots that it sees driving the Russian perspective and actions.
So what does this all mean then, if we try to boil it down? This source offers one, well, powerful, historically rooted perspective on why history seems to weigh so heavily on Russia's present actions. It suggests a fundamental difference in how war is perceived compared to nations maybe like the U.S., a difference forged, it argues, in centuries of invasion and truly immense loss.
Yeah, it really highlights how these contrasting historical experiences can lead to vastly different understandings of current events, different ideas about national security, about survival itself.
And perhaps it suggests this can lead to significant miscalculations, maybe on all sides, when nations with such different historical lenses interact.
That seems to be an underlying implication, yes. The potential for misunderstanding based on these deep-seated views.
So here's something maybe to think about, drawing from what the source emphasized. Given this focus on historical trauma and survival, how might a nation's collective memory of past wars, whether it's Russia's or any nation's, influence its approach to seeking peace, or even how it defines security in the future? What stands out to you in looking through this particular historical lens presented today?